The next time you walk into a grocery store and look at a shelf of canned tuna, you are not looking at a stable commodity. You are looking at a ticking financial clock. Most people treat canned food like a permanent fixture of modern convenience, a background item that is always there, always cheap, and completely immune to the chaos of the outside world. That assumption is a dangerous illusion. The price tag on that can of Starkist, Bumblebee, or Chicken of the Sea right now represents the final moments of an outdated economic reality. What is heading toward that aisle isn't a standard wave of inflation. It is a structural convergence of three separate, global systems collapsing into the exact same square foot of retail space. We are talking about a product that anchors almost every long-term food storage plan in the country. A single standard can of tuna delivers roughly 20 grams of pure, complete protein for about 100 calories. It is the ultimate efficiency baseline for household preparedness. Yet, behind that familiar metal cylinder lies a complex web of international treaties, trade enforcement mechanisms, and regulatory quotas that are tightening simultaneously. The United States government maintains a strict annual tariff rate quota on tuna imported in airtight containers. It is a hard legal ceiling on how much fish can enter the country at a lower duty rate each calendar year. That number is recalculated every 12 months based on the previous year's import volumes. There is no public debate, no congressional vote, and no evening news coverage. It is a quiet bureaucratic adjustment buried inside trade documents that moves the economic ceiling against the consumer without warning. On top of that quota sits a 25% tariff burden specifically targeting value-added seafood products processed in China. This is not a tax on the raw fish swimming in the ocean. It is a direct penalty on the processing and canning infrastructure that major brands rely on to keep retail prices artificially low. When that penalty hits the processing layer, it doesn't vanish into corporate balance sheets. It moves directly down the supply chain until it reaches the edge of the grocery shelf. And while those two financial pressures are squeezing the product from the top, a third, environmental mechanism is cutting out the foundation from below. The World Trade Organization's recent subsidy restructuring is actively dismantling the financial lifelines of distant water fishing fleets internationally. This global treaty was designed to curb overfishing by scaling back government subsidies, but its immediate real-world consequence is a steady, predictable contraction of the global wild catch supply over the next several years. A quota structure, a tariff penalty, and a global subsidy collapse. Three completely independent systems, run by different international institutions on different timelines, none of them coordinating with the others, all converging on the exact same metal can. It does not matter which brand you buy. The label is entirely irrelevant because every single player in that aisle is standing inside the exact same systemic exposure. This is the hidden reality of the modern grocery store. The products we rely on for stability are actually the most vulnerable, tied to international supply chains that are fracturing in plain sight. Most consumers are completely blind to this because the numbers they see on the shelves today do not reflect current market conditions. They reflect manufacturing contracts and corporate hedging strategies that were locked in 6 to 9 months ago. The price you are paying today is a historical artifact. The real data, the earnings calls, the customs enforcement logs, and the maritime shipping manifests shows that the cost of putting food in a tin container is accelerating at a pace that retail pricing hasn't even begun to digest. If you are waiting for prices to normalize before you secure your household pantry, you are miscalculating the physics of the market. The shelf you are looking at today is the cheapest, most abundant version of that shelf you will see for the foreseeable future. Every single regulatory mechanism, treaty phase-in, and material shortage described in this data is legally locked in through at least 2027. The clock is thus already re-running, and the window to buy ahead of the curve is closing faster than most shoppers realize. To understand how the American grocery cart became a financial battleground, you have to look at the structural machinery of global trade policy and the inescapable reality of domestic manufacturing limits. This is not a sudden, unpredictable crisis. The foundations for today's rising retail prices were laid systematically over the last decade through a series of federal trade actions and corporate consolidations that created a geographic trap for food packagers. In 2018, the United States imposed sweeping national security tariffs on imported steel and aluminum under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. These measures placed a 25% tariff on steel imports and a 10% tariff on aluminum imports. While these policies aimed to revitalize domestic metal production, they triggered a cascading cost crisis for the container manufacturing sector, which relies heavily on ultra-thin, specialized tinplate steel to produce double-seamed food cans. w.supplychaindive.com. The immediate consequence of these tariffs was a sharp divergence between domestic metal prices and global benchmarks. The domestic price of tinplate steel in the United States accelerated dramatically, fluctuating between $950 and $1,150 per metric ton. This price surge was compounded by the fact that American steel producers did not possess the specific rolling mill capacity required to manufacture high-quality, ultra-thin container sheet at the scale demanded by the food processing industry. Major food brands found themselves trapped. They could either buy imported steel and pay the heavy tariff penalty at the border, or buy from a limited pool of domestic suppliers who raised their prices to match the tariff-inflated market. The financial scale of this trap became completely undeniable during recent corporate disclosures. In its fiscal year 2026 earnings reports, the Campbell Soup Company explicitly stated that steel and aluminum tariffs had become a primary driver of operational strain within its Simple Meals portfolio, forcing a 240 basis point contraction in its year-over-year gross margin. Campbell's executive leadership openly disclosed to investors that the company estimates these tariffs will add approximately 4% to its total cost of goods sold, with internal cost-cutting measures capable of absorbing only 60% of the shock. The remaining 40% is being transferred directly to retail price tags. www.mordaurintelligence.com. You show too. This container crisis is colliding with an entirely separate regulatory bottleneck along the southern border of the United States. Under the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, or UFLPA, which went into effect in 2022, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency implemented a strict rebuttable presumption standard for all goods sourced from or linked to specific manufacturing regions. While initial enforcement actions focused heavily on textiles and electronics, federal tracking data shows that customs inspectors have aggressively expanded their scope to encompass agricultural imports, specifically targeting processed tomato products, paste, and bulk sources. Because the modern global supply chain frequently routes raw agricultural inputs through third-party processing hubs, major American brands like Hunt's and Contadina face intense compliance burdens. A single shipment of tomato paste can be detained at a port of entry for weeks, while compliance officers audit hundreds of pages of labor verification logs, shipping manifests, and field-level payroll records. These regulatory delays create immediate physical artificial scarcity, forcing domestic food packers to source alternative ingredients from high-cost local markets or leave their processing lines completely idle at the exact same time. The physical environment has broken the traditional production models of North American agriculture. The United States Department of Agriculture and the Mexican National Water Commission have documented an extended multi-year drought across the primary growing regions of northwestern Mexico, particularly in Sinaloa, which serves as the critical winter supply corridor for the North American market. Total Mexican tomato production is forecast to drop by nearly 3% this calendar year due to severe water allocation cuts and depleted reservoir levels. In past decades, a regional crop failure in Mexico could be offset by shifting procurement to domestic growers in California's Central Valley. However, California growers are navigating their own structural traps, including strict groundwater pumping restrictions under the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and surging agricultural labor costs. The result is a perfect historical and geographic bottleneck. Container manufacturers cannot escape the tariff wall because domestic steel mills lack the capacity to supply them. Food processors cannot easily import raw ingredients because federal customs authorities are holding shipments under heightened enforcement protocols. And regional agricultural hubs can no longer guarantee consistent yields due to systemic environmental limits. This is the exact machinery behind the shelf pricing that consumers see today. The store brand can of green beans or sweet corn that looks like a cheap alternative is actually trailing the name brand price increases by a precise multi-month contract window. Private label manufacturers operate on rigid quarterly procurement schedules, meaning they are currently draining inventory produced under older pre-crisis material costs. When those corporate contracts expire and are renegotiated under current market realities, that artificial price gap will close instantly. The entire infrastructure of mass-produced, shelf-stable food has reached its geographic and financial limit. This industrial gridlock has moved beyond corporate projections and regulatory delays. It is now forcing a direct confrontation between major food manufacturers and the federal government. The underlying friction comes down to an undeniable manufacturing reality. American food companies cannot operate without foreign steel, yet federal trade policies are actively punishing them for importing it. The trade data demonstrates that the domestic steel industry has systematically dismantled its own tin plate production infrastructure over the last decade. Robert Budway, the president of the Can Manufacturers Institute, recently confirmed that American can makers and canned food producers are now forced to import nearly 80% of their raw tin plate steel from foreign trade partners. Conagra Brands Chief Executive Officer Sean Connolly supported this finding, stating that his company has no viable choice but to source the majority of its canned food packagings from overseas because approximately 75% of the tin plate steel lines inside the United States have been completely eliminated since 2018. NeefOffDive.com. This structural dependence has transformed corporate earnings calls into public warnings about margin compression and retail price increases. During an executive investor session, Campbell's chief financial officer Carrie Anderson disclosed that Section 232 duties on steel and aluminum account for more than half of the company's total projected tariff exposure for fiscal year 2026. Campbell's chief executive officer Mick Beekhuizen addressed this supply ceiling directly, stating that there is simply not enough specialized tin plate capacity available inside the United States to fulfill domestic manufacturing demand, forcing the company to import critical raw materials while absorbing heavy, non-negotiable financial penalties. The company confirmed that its internal productivity initiatives can mitigate only 60% of these escalating tariff expenses. The remaining 40% represents a fixed cost addition that is currently being integrated into the list prices of its core retail portfolios. To prevent a complete loss of market share, corporate leaders are shifting from broad inflationary increases to highly surgical price adjustments targeted at high-volume, shelf-stable staples like ready-to-serve soups, canned pastas, and prepared gravies. w.supplychaindive.com. Mission 1. The friction is expanding rapidly across the entire consumer packaged goods industry. The Consumer Brands Association, which represents major global food manufacturers including Coca-Cola, Del Monte Foods, and Conagra, recently issued a formal economic impact analysis warning that the latest 50% tariff expansion on imported steel could force an immediate 9 to 15% retail price spike across all canned food categories. Tom Madrecki, the Vice President of Supply Chain Resiliency for the association, publicly cautioned that the domestic steel industry fundamentally lacks the technical quality and volume capacity required by American can makers, meaning these tariffs function as a direct tax on the food production chain rather than an incentive for domestic industrial growth. The association's data models warn that if consumer purchasing habits drop in response to these double-digit price hikes, up to 20,000 domestic food manufacturing jobs could be endangered as companies reduce production capacity or aggressively transition away from traditional tin plate steel toward alternative packaging materials like polyethylene terephthalate plastics and multi-layer aseptic pouches. www.dive.com. Yesho 1. This operational strain is causing immediate tactical shifts on the factory floor, altering the physical characteristics of the products entering the market. When raw material costs become impossible to absorb, food processors deploy alternative strategies to protect their operating margins without triggering consumer backlash over rising shelf prices. This has led to the quiet expansion of structural shrinkflation. a process where manufacturers subtly reduce the net weight of a product while maintaining its external packaging dimensions and retail price point. In the heavy prepared foods segment, which includes meat-based stews and chunky chilies, this reduction is achieved by modifying the specific ingredient ratios inside the container. Because protein components require high-temperature retort sterilization and carry the highest raw material costs, food processors are systematically decreasing the volume of solid meat chunks, while increasing the proportion of water-based gravies, sodium-dense starches, and filler vegetables. The consumer purchases what appears to be the identical can of beef stew or chili, but the actual nutritional density and caloric value of the container have been permanently dialed back. For independent seafood packers, the operational bottleneck has turned into a regulatory dead end. Importers of shelf-stable proteins like sardines, mackerel, and tuna are navigating a strict trade enforcement matrix that leaves no room for corporate cost mitigation. Federal customs authorities are actively cross-referencing shipping manifests against the updated tracking databases of the Marine Mammal Protection Act and current international seafood bans. When a shipment of canned fish arrives at a domestic port of entry, any ambiguity regarding the geographic origin of the catch, the registration of the fishing vessel, or the third-party processing facility results in an immediate administrative hold. These detained containers generate steep storage fees at the port, compounding the initial material cost of the product. The major packing brands are trapped in a high-stakes compliance environment where a single documentation error can invalidate an entire quarterly supply contract, accelerating the depletion of domestic wholesale inventories and ensuring that the physical supply of shelf-stable goods remains structurally suppressed.